I'm Renee Richard, and I'm standing here on the grounds of Xavier University in New Orleans. This great university was founded about 1915, and this is the only African-American Catholic university in the entire United States. And the reason that we're here today, right here, is to talk about the foundress of this place, and that is St. Katherine Drexel. So join us on today's episode as we explore her life, her work, and her legacy. I have as my guest today Sister Mary Ann Stockhow, and she is a professor here, and you're a member of St. Katherine Drexel's religious order, which is the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. And I'm gonna let her tell you her educational background because I've been practicing it and I can't get it right. But
well, I started off with a degree in elementary education from Xavier, so I tell the students I sat in some of these same rooms.
I was just like you.
Yes, yes, exactly. And then after teaching in some of our elementary schools here in the city, I also did a master's program at Notre Dame Seminary in religious education. And then after that, I was urged to get a degree in theology, master's in theology, prior to coming to teach at Xavier in 1981. And after a couple of years teaching here, Xavier said, "We want you to go get your doctorate." So I went to Catholic University of America to do a biblical studies PhD in biblical languages and literature at Catholic University in America. So
in Washington, D.C.
In Washington, D.C. So one of these days I'll actually hang those diplomas up on my office wall. But right now
and
they're
write
just,
a book.
Maybe write a book, or at least an article.
Yeah.
So that's basically, my training here. But I've been at Xavier since 1981, except for those years I was working on the PhD. But I was only working on the PhD to come back to teach at Xavier.
Here,
yes.
Which is totally amazing. And
yes.
so, your foundress, Sister St. Katherine Drexel. I still want to say sister because, to me, she became a saint just recently in my head in 2000. She founded the order there, but she had a very strong tie here, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But tell us a little bit about her life and what led up to her becoming.
She was probably the most unlikely person to do what she did, because she was raised as a wealthy young woman whose father was a banker, whose social status was in the upper crust of Philadelphia, and they were unique, and they were one of the few Catholic families that were also people of wealth at that time in the 1800s. Her father had actually been one of the directors for the Union Pacific Railroad, and so through their childhood, if they would travel, they traveled in their private railroad car. And so the three daughters that they eventually had, the travels they did were part of their education. So the family had a very interesting background, where you had the mother of Catherine and Elizabeth was actually Hannah Langstroth, who was a German Protestant, a Mennonite family at the Church of the Brethren. And so Catherine, growing up, had relatives who were Catholic and relatives who weren't Catholic, and so that gave her a broader sense of, so we might say, church.
Right.
So when they were growing up, the example of their stepmother, Emma Bouyer Drexel, was one that was very influential. That was really the mother that both Elizabeth, the firstborn daughter, and Catherine knew, because Catherine's birth mother died just a few weeks after she was born. And I tell our Xavier pre-med students, do you think it's by accident that here this wealthy family could not get adequate medical care to prevent a post-childbirth death on the part of, so as rich as they were, money couldn't buy what you all are being hopefully trained to do. So I kind of bring that out to the pre-meds to let them know that, that St. Katherine might have had something to do with this. So in her basic training, she was, with her sisters, taught by a governess. Whenever they would travel, they would correspond with the governess through many, many letters. And then as the girls got older, their mother, and they always considered Emma their mother because
Right.
they didn't say
They were so young.
stepmother. Yeah, and she was the one they grew up knowing. She would open her home 3 times a week to give assistance to the poorer families. She also employed what we would call a social worker to help check on some of the families to see if the support was giving them the assistance they needed and everything.
Which
so
is-
the girls saw that as they were growing up, that their family's idea about, yes, we have been blessed with great wealth, but it's in trust to us to see that we share it with others. And you can imagine in the 1800s, that many a Catholic priest and bishop knew the address of the
Oh,
Drexel
yes.
home
Oh,
in
yes.
Philadelphia because they were one of the few wealthy Catholic families that also had that sense of stewardship.
And then live that
they
world. I
lived
mean,
it,
how often
yeah.
do you hear about
Yeah.
this? And when we talk about the 1800s, St. Catherine was actually born in 1855. Yeah, because she was like
1858. She died in 1955.
55 at 96 or so.
Yeah,
correct?
she died in March, and she would have been 97 in November.
So, yeah, so we're talking about a critical time, particularly following the Civil War, all of that time frame, with poverty, and these people were taking people into their home. And so she saw that those works of mercy
Yeah.
from her stepmother that really, I'm sure, probably influenced
Very
her
much, and
extremely.
hearing from the bishops and priests who were coming, the needs of the Native Americans. So she was seeing the local poverty there in Philadelphia that would have included both immigrants and African Americans, but then from the bishops and the missionary priests, hearing about the needs. And this is when the government was in the process of trying to force the tribes onto reservations because of the westward movement after the Civil War. And so the whole question of, what religious help and training could be given to the Native Americans, especially to those who had already been evangelized by Benedictines or Jesuit missionaries, but now the government reservation system was just going to assign them to a particular church. And so the Catholic bishops were rather concerned about that. And so Catherine, one of her first gifts that she did with her own checkbook was to donate some statues to a Native American mission out on the West Coast that she and her family had visited there. And so that was when she had her very own checkbook after her social debut, when she was considered, an adult young woman. And as I said, the girls were very popular. They had an active social life. And the tragedies that came into the family came through Mr. Drexel's heart attack, which was a very sudden thing that happened. And prior to that, they were used to him coming in, and they had a chapel in their home, and he would spend time in
He was
prayer.
very devout, right.
Very, very, very strong Austrian Catholic roots. And so, that his death struck the whole family very hard. And then her stepmother, Emma, developed cancer. So Catherine
Right.
actually nursed her for about 3 years,
3 years.
through the cancer. And that seems to have been a kind of another critical change in her outlook, that death is pretty final. And then she began to think about her own ultimate possibilities, and she began to have an interest in religious life. And we know some of these things from the correspondence between herself and first Father O'Connor and Bishop O'Connor. So the chaplain, the pastor of the parish in what's now Torresdale, Pennsylvania, where the Drexels had their summer home, was Father James O'Connor, who ultimately would become Bishop O'Connor of Omaha. And so as Catherine was a young woman growing up, he became her spiritual director, and he was very strong about her staying as a young, socially prominent woman and giving the example of good Christian living in society. But she kept trying to convince him that she believed she had a religious vocation. So her ideal was, give my share of the money to somebody to do the work, and I want to go to the cloister. And so God had another plan. So when she had traveled a bit out west and seen some of the needs in the Native American areas, the reservations and some of the pueblos, she, like many women of wealth, had opportunities to travel to Europe. And as a wealthy young Catholic woman, she had a private audience with Pope Leo XIII. And so one of the things she wanted to do at the time of the audience was ask him, could he find some religious orders to come and work with the
In the
Native
in the
Americans, and she was also beginning to hear more about the needs in the South, the post-Civil War South. And so the Holy Father's words to her that got passed on in the congregation was, my child, why not become a missionary yourself? And she's saying, it's like, oh, who, me? And so she went back and forth with Bishop O'Connor in writing. Many letters went back and forth between the two of them, where he was still saying, I don't think that you're really cut out for this. I mean, you lived the life of privilege and everything. How could you possibly fit into religious life? And she keeps saying, well, it seems like this is what God is telling me.
That's right.
And what eventually happened, her perseverance eventually convinced him that, yes, this must be from God. And then the next question was how and who and where. He had, I think it was his aunt, was the superior of the Sisters of Mercy Convent in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And so the upshot was that he arranged with his aunt to take Katherine in as a postulant and novice, with the intention that after her training she would start her own congregation. So according to the archives, that after the word got out that Miss Drexel was going to the convent,
It made the front headlines on the newspaper.
So
I remember seeing that.
Yeah, and by that time her sister Elizabeth was married and sort of settled, and was actually, when Katherine was going there, was expecting a child. Her younger sister hadn't yet married, Louise was going to be married shortly after that. But Elizabeth likewise had a premature birth, and the baby, little boy, and herself died. So again, when I think about the pre-meds here, it's like, here's another wealthy family that could not get the medical care to save both child and mother. So the way that Mr. Drexel's will had been written before, while his daughters were still there, he was worried about protecting them from fortune hunters.
Right.
So each of the girls had an equal share in his investments, the profit from them, and neither they nor their husbands could touch the principal.
Right.
That after their deaths, the principal would be divided up among their children. Well, so now Elizabeth has died in childbirth. When Louise married Edward Morel, they never had any children. And so you had the situation where after Elizabeth's death, the two girls shared the income from the investments, which there's so many different amounts that depending on if you're trying to put it into 2018 dollars versus what it was in the 1800s. It was a number of millions of dollars, about
in
20
the 1800s, yes.
Which went so much further in those days. And so when Katherine was dealing with this idea of religious vocation, when Bishop O'Connor says to her, okay, no, you've got to start your own community, because if you just try to give it to some other order, what's to say that they won't shift from this main mission that you have?
Right.
And so, she was very conscious of her vow of poverty, yet she had canonically the authority to write checks and to disperse that money. But she was always very conscious of her personal poverty. I mean, she mended her own shoes. Mm-hmm. She used the little pencil stubs until they were down to almost nothing. And so while she had the wealth to give to the missions, she didn't use it for herself. Mm-hmm. And so that was her balancing of needing to be custodian of her father's income, but at the same time, for her personal vow of poverty, to observe it as fully and completely as she could. So that was why when they were in the early days, when they were trying to decide what we would look like, in the days when everybody had to have a set habit, the sisters apparently dressed a small doll. This was when they're in from Pittsburgh, and they come to the Drexel home at Torresdale while the Ben Salem, Cornwallis Heights property was being built. And so they dressed the doll in their proposed habit. And the Archbishop of Philadelphia sent it back to him saying it was too feminine.
Oh, goodness.
So, we never did ever see a picture. We think we know that it was something a little bit more like the Benedictines were wearing, because there's a picture actually of St. Clair with just a little wimple and a little black veil, and it was over the door that entered into our chapel. And so we kind of think maybe that was the closest we had to what that first proposed habit. So we wound up having basically the mercy habit with the Franciscan cord, the Benedictine scapular, and the Dominican rosary, and on feast days and on adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, a white wool Carmelite choir mantle. So that was part of her American adopting of various parts of the religious habits to kind of indicate the spirituality that she was interested in fostering among her sisters, and also the roots that we had with the Mercy Sisters. So they've been our godmothers, just as the Presentation Sisters were their godmothers when Catherine Macaulay was founding them. So the Mercy Sisters then gave us, our initial formation. And even when Mother Catherine pronounced her first vows in 1891, the superiors there at the Mercy Convent agreed to send a couple of their senior sisters with this new little band, the one professed sister and the little novices from Mother Catherine's community, to send them to this temporary mother house to give them continual guidance until they got their religious sea legs stabilized.
Oh, right. Good. Sister Marianne, we were talking about St. Katherine Drexel and leading up to, she founded this order. So tell us a little bit about her work with which she envisioned.
Having seen the great need among the Native Americans and also the need among the Black people in the South, she was very convinced that education was the answer. So one of her first desires was to form schools in these various areas, so that she wanted to send the sisters out. So starting around 1894, when they'd had enough sort of foundation time, she started sending some to the west and then also down to the area near Richmond, Virginia, where there was she founded a boarding school in both places so that the children could come in and begin to get the education. And as her work became known, numerous requests came from not just all over the United States, but we know from our archives all over the world.
Wow.
So she funded many places where she never had sisters to go, but she also helped the Holy Family Sisters, the Josephite priests, the Holy Spirit priests, I think even the Precious Blood Fathers up in the Midwest, so that if she had a chance to help, help someone who was working in the same general areas, missions to the Native Americans and African Americans, if she could get enough money, she would help all those out. So in the South here, she knew the Holy Family Sisters were down here, and she didn't want to seem to be taking over, sort of like their mission areas. But Archbishop Blank here in New Orleans approached her by letter in the early I think it was about 1914, 1913, to try to get some higher education under the Catholic auspices for the Black Catholics here in the New Orleans area, but including the rural areas, because that, at that time, the Archdiocese of New Orleans went further
Yes,
further
we were not a
west
diocese at all.
Yeah, and so this led her to founding First Xavier University Preparatory High School in what was the old Southern University building down on Magazine Street. And the progress was first to have the various high school grades, and then when they got to the 12th grade, then they added a normal program for training, especially the women, to be teachers.
I was about to say, normal program pretty much was for teachers.
And then continuing to add new areas, culminating in our getting a state charter as a university in 1925. And then we had the founding of the College of Pharmacy in 1927. So the progress of the school was so great that they were outgrowing the building down on Magazine Street. And so that brought us up to this campus in 1932 and the building of the original buildings. And so her sense was that the dignity of the students that would be here deserved a building a university in
complex,
keeping
right.
with their dignity as children of God. And so she was making a statement by what she put up, not just, the teachers that she sent. And very early on, she decided to send the sisters to Catholic University, the Sisters College there, to get the advanced training. And so at one point, we had more sisters working in our schools in the dioceses eventually of Baton Rouge, Alexandria, Lake Charles, all those areas that had their actual teaching credentials than many of the others at that time, because she felt, the education that the poor deserve should be of the highest quality in keeping with their dignity as children of God. So that was part of her motivating auspices of saying, okay, not just any old thing will do, but
Right.
to try to give the best. And so that's one of the motives of Xavier trying to be the best possible education system here for the students, even though sometimes they were making them work too hard, but that's all right. And so likewise out west, that the schools that we've had there, and the individual missions on the Pueblos and other areas with the
Navajos,
concentration
plenty
of Native Americans, to try to bring the best that could possibly be given to enable the people in these areas to grow into their full stature as equal children of God. So that's part of what she says. And then all of that had to be, of course, rooted in prayer. And so we've had, our tradition was exposition of the Blessed Sacrament during the daytime hours, because since she did have us out teaching, we were not to have the 24-hour ones, because we have,
Right.
Her basic thing was, you have to serve the poor, and so you need to sleep right, eat right, and be ready to serve with energy. So that's always been part of, her philosophy, that you didn't need to have it extravagant, but it had to be solid so that you would be able to do what the people
work,
needed.
right. The
So
work that was
yeah,
needed.
and then so you had that prayer and ministry, and she had some of us trained as nurses, some as social workers, et cetera, but the majority of us have been in education somehow.
Because that's her.
That was
baby.
her understanding.
That was her, what she really
because she
wanted.
realized without education, the people would be trapped in poverty, that the only way to break out of it was to have the chance to have a good, solid education and then develop the gifts and talents that God had given to both groups of people, and that they would be able to assume the leadership in their own communities.
We were talking earlier, and you were talking about the different Native Americans in the groups and her educating them. But one of the things I read too is where she even funded like manuals for Mass or catechisms as well, in their language, like for the Navajos, so that in learning not just about their faith, but in full participation for Mass and everything else. And this was something she was.
This was a project of the Franciscans. So they had,
Okay.
we worked with, I think it's the Guadalupe province of Franciscan friars, who especially worked with us on the Navajo reservation, and their work in actually creating both a written alphabet and a written form of the language, so that the
Awesome.
catechisms could be taught. And eventually, with the Second Vatican Council, those could be used in the liturgies. Of course, in Mother Catherine's day, it was still all Latin. So
That's true. That's true.
Yeah,
At the point
so
where she died in what,
in 1955. So that made it, the priests would be doing the evangelization, and you also then had from the different groups of the Native Americans, the catechists, who would be able to then both read the scriptures and teach in their own language to the people. And I remember one of our sisters, who was a Pueblo herself, from Laguna Pueblo, she said in a workshop she gave to us, that before the missionaries arrived, we believed in the great Creator God, we believed in the Great Spirit. All they had to do was to introduce us to Jesus. So that's
great.
always stuck with me as a
You're
sense
right.
of accepting the great religious richness of these various cultures that we've been sort of gifted to be part of. Same thing, too, in the various parts of the South and the cities in the Northwest, to see the great gifts that the people have, and especially the magnificent way that since Vatican II, that those gifts of worship and prayer have been able to flourish. So here in our chapel,
Beautiful
you see
chapel.
Jesus here is shown as an African-American man to represent that he is part of all of us, and we are part of him, no matter what our race or ethnicity might be.
Right.
And so that's an important part of what we try, to inculcate even here at the university, since now we're so diverse in the population.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was one of the things that I was reading about. For our audience to understand about Xavier is that it is recognized as the only African-American Catholic university in the United States. You were saying in the entire
hemisphere, I think, yeah.
Hemisphere. And in that light, though, they are multi-religious, multicultural, ethnicity in all ways. So we do see a lot. And from what I understand, represented here are 40 different states and 20 different countries.
Yes.
So this is a fabulous university, and well-rounded. So I've been very impressed.
It's been amazing
she would
to
be
see,
very
that
proud.
Her desire to draw all to Christ and to be a focus of unity, as she dedicated us to the Eucharist. It's being enfleshed, as we speak here. That from the time of segregation, when it was pretty much, African Americans had to be educated in one place, whites in another, and there weren't as many other ethnicities here in the city. But now Xavier has blossomed to having such a wonderfully diverse population that still there's a theology requirement for everybody. There's philosophy. So we still are strong about our liberal arts foundation, so that when the students do move on in their studies, they have that base that they can build upon. So that's teachers here work hard.
Yeah, I gather that from what I've heard.
Okay. And so that's part of the beauty of Xavier now, and that we've grown from that seed that St. Katherine Drexel planted back in, with the high school in 1915, and this campus in 1932, and alumni come back and they look around and they say, oh my goodness.
Well, that's another thing is the growth here.
Yes.
From the beautiful building that was originally designed, that we'll put pictures up for people to see, because it has a different look to it. Over the years, y'all have expanded so much, and I believe now there's land on the other side of the canal that's here, excuse me, for future growth, and it does have this worldwide reputation of being an excellent liberal arts school. So, Sister, I thank you for being here and for telling us so much about St. Katherine Drexel. Well, I'm sitting there in my head going, Xavier, St. Katherine, and this was her baby, so it's awesome. So thank you so much for being,
wanting to know more about her.
Absolutely, and for educating our audience on her and her life and her work. So thank you.
Always more to learn. Thank you. Yes, it's my pleasure.
That's fine. And join us for another episode of Roots of Faith.